Imagine yourself in a world where teachers bully students without consequences. Shocking, isn't it? But what if the situation suddenly changed? In this heartwarming story, an authoritarian teacher's reign of terror crumbles when she unknowingly targets the principal's autistic son. You won't believe it. The crisp September air carried a hint of anticipation as Alex Johnson, a slender 12-year-old with tousled brown hair and inquisitive hazel eyes, stood before the imposing brick facade of Maplewood Middle School. His fingers nervously played with the straps of his worn backpack, a silent reminder of the familiar comfort he'd left behind at his old school. Taking a deep breath, Alex pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the bustling hallway. The cacophony of lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking on linoleum, and excited chatter enveloped him. He fumbled with the crumpled schedule in his pocket, squinting at the room numbers until he found his destination. Room 205, Mrs. Thompson's class. As Alex approached the classroom, the noise in the hallway seemed to dim. A palpable tension hung in the air, causing several students to hesitate before entering. Curious, Alex peered inside. The room was meticulously organized, with perfectly aligned desks and motivational posters adorning the walls. At the front stood Mrs. Thompson, a tall woman in her 50s, with steel gray hair pulled into a tight bun and sharp, scrutinizing eyes behind horn-rimmed glasses. "Well?" Mrs. Thompson's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Are you going to stand there gawking all day, or are you going to take your seat?" Alex's cheeks flushed as he hurried to an empty desk near the back of the room. He could feel the weight of his classmates' sympathetic glances, but no one dared to speak. Mrs. Thompson's heels clicked against the floor as she approached Alex's desk. "You must be our new student," she said, her voice dripping with barely concealed disdain. "Alexander Johnson, is it?" "Yes, ma'am," Alex replied softly, his eyes fixed on the desktop. "But I prefer Alex, if that's okay." Mrs. Thompson's lips thinned into a tight line. "In my classroom, young man, you'll be addressed as I see fit. Now tell me, what sort of education did you receive at your previous school? I do hope it's prepared you for the rigorous standards we maintain here at Maplewood." Alex swallowed hard, feeling the eyes of his classmates boring into him. I did well in my classes, Mrs. Thompson. I especially enjoyed literature and—" "We'll see about that," she interrupted, her tone dismissive. "I've found that students who claim to enjoy literature often have a superficial understanding at best. You'll need to prove yourself here, Alexander." As Mrs. Thompson turned back to the front of the room, Alex sank lower in his seat. He was used to being quiet and introspective, preferring to observe and absorb his surroundings before engaging. But something about Mrs. Thompson's demeanor made him want to disappear entirely. The lesson began, a discussion on To Kill a Mockingbird. As Mrs. Thompson fired questions at the class, Alex found himself captivated by the story's themes of injustice and moral courage. He raised his hand, eager to share an insight about Atticus Finch's character. Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed as they landed on Alex. "Yes, Alexander? Do you have something to contribute?" "I was thinking about how Atticus shows bravery by—" "I'm sure we're all fascinated by your thoughts," Mrs. Thompson cut in, her voice laced with sarcasm. "But perhaps it would be best if you listened and learned from your classmates who are more familiar with our discussion format. We wouldn't want you to embarrass yourself on your first day, would we?" A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up. Alex felt his face burning as he lowered his hand, his enthusiasm crushed under the weight of Mrs. Thompson's words. As the bell rang signaling the end of class, Alex gathered his books with shaking hands. He had faced challenges before, but something about Mrs. Thompson's calculated cruelty left him feeling more alone than he'd ever felt in a classroom. Little did Alex know, this was only the beginning of a battle that would test not only his resilience, but the very fabric of Maplewood Middle School's educational philosophy. The days that followed Alex's arrival at Maplewood Middle School blurred into a monotonous cycle of dread and anxiety. Each morning, as he trudged up the worn stone steps, the weight of his backpack seemed to increase, laden not with books, but with the growing burden of Mrs. Thompson's relentless scrutiny. In the fluorescent-lit classroom, Alex found himself the unwilling center of attention. Mrs. Thompson's eyes, sharp and calculating behind her glasses, seemed to track his every movement. Her voice, once merely stern, had taken on a cruel edge when directed at him. "Alexander," she would say, drawing out each syllable like a cat toying with its prey. Since you seem so confident in your abilities, perhaps you'd like to explain to the class the significance of the mockingbird metaphor in Lee's novel." Alex would straighten in his seat, his palms sweaty as he gripped the edges of his desk. "The mockingbird represents innocence and—" "Incorrect," Mrs. Thompson would interject, her lips curling into a smirk. "If you had been paying attention instead of daydreaming, you would know that we've moved on to discussing symbolism in The Great Gatsby. Do try to keep up, Alexander." The other students would shift uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Alex and Mrs. Thompson. Some wore expressions of pity, others relief that they weren't the target of her ire. But none dared to speak up, fear of becoming the next victim silencing any potential allies. As the weeks wore on, Alex found himself retreating further into his shell. The bright-eyed, curious boy who had entered Maplewood Middle School was slowly being replaced by a shadow, hunched and silent at his desk. He began to dread class discussions, his hand remaining firmly in his lap, even when he knew the answer, the risk of drawing Mrs. Thompson's attention too great. One particularly grueling afternoon, as rain lashed against the classroom windows, Mrs. Thompson announced a pop quiz on the latest chapter of The Great Gatsby. Alex's stomach churned as he stared down at the paper, the words swimming before his eyes. He had read the chapter twice the night before, but under Mrs. Thompson's withering gaze, every bit of knowledge seemed to evaporate. As she collected the quizzes, Mrs. Thompson paused at Alex's desk. "Well, Alexander," she said, loud enough for the entire class to hear, "I do hope you've managed to string together at least a few coherent sentences this time. Although, given your performance so far, I won't hold my breath." A few stifled giggles echoed through the room, quickly silenced by Mrs. Thompson's sharp glare. Alex felt his cheeks burn, his eyes fixed firmly on the scratched surface of his desk. That evening, as Alex sat at the kitchen table pushing his dinner around his plate, his father, Mr. Johnson, noticed his son's unusual quietness. "Everything all right at school, Alex?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Alex opened his mouth, the words of frustration and hurt balanced on the tip of his tongue. But as he met his father's worried gaze, he faltered. How could he explain the daily torment, the feeling of being singled out and belittled? Would his father, the school principal, even believe that one of his teachers could be so cruel? "It's fine, Dad," Alex mumbled, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just adjusting to the new curriculum." Mr. Johnson nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, but a nagging doubt lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss with his usually talkative and enthusiastic son. As Alex lay in bed that night, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on his ceiling, he made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't let Mrs. Thompson break him. Somewhere beneath the fear and self-doubt, a spark of defiance flickered to life. Little did he know, that spark was about to ignite a blaze that would change Maplewood Middle School forever. The autumn leaves were turning vibrant shades of red and gold outside the classroom window, but inside room 205, the atmosphere remained as gray and oppressive as ever. Alex sat at his desk, his posture a mix of resignation and simmering frustration. Today's literature assignment was a discussion on The Catcher in the Rye, and despite his better judgment, Alex found himself drawn into the conversation. Mrs. Thompson paced at the front of the room, her voice sharp as she dissected Holden Caulfield's character. Clearly, Holden's behavior is nothing more than the petulant tantrums of a spoiled, entitled youth. Wouldn't you agree, Klassen? A sea of nodding heads greeted her words, students eager to avoid becoming her next target. But something in Alex snapped. He had spent countless nights poring over the novel, finding solace in Holden's struggle against a world that seemed determined to misunderstand him. Before he could stop himself, his hand shot into the air. Mrs. Thompson's eyebrows arched in surprise. Well, well, Alexander has decided to grace us with his input. This should be illuminating. Her tone dripped with sarcasm. Go ahead, Alexander. Dazzle us with your literary insights. Alex took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. I don't think that's entirely fair to Holden, Mrs. Thompson. He's dealing with grief, isolation, and a world that feels phony to him. His behavior isn't just entitlement, it's a cry for help and understanding. The classroom fell silent. Students glanced nervously between Alex and Mrs. Thompson, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed dangerously. A cry for help? She sneered. How quaint. I suppose next you'll tell us that Holden's expulsion was just a misunderstanding? That we should coddle every misguided youth who can't be bothered to follow rules or show respect? Alex felt a flush creeping up his neck, but he pressed on. That's not what I meant. I just think there's more to Holden's story than… Enough! Mrs. Thompson's voice cracked like a whip. I've had quite enough of your misguided interpretations, Alexander. It's clear that you lack the maturity and insight to grasp the nuances of this novel. Perhaps if you spent more time studying and less time daydreaming, you might actually contribute something of value to this class. The words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. Alex felt as if all the oxygen had been sucked from the room. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears, feel the stares of his classmates boring into him. But beneath the humiliation, something else was growing, a fierce, burning indignation. With all due respect, Mrs. Thompson, Alex said, his voice surprisingly steady, I don't think you're being fair, to me or to the book. There's more than one way to interpret literature and… Fair? Mrs. Thompson spat the word as if it tasted foul. Life isn't fair, Alexander. The sooner you learn that, the better. In my classroom, you'll learn to respect authority and accept that those with more knowledge and experience than you know best. Alex opened his mouth to respond, but at that moment, the classroom door swung open. The entire class turned, startled by the interruption. In the doorway stood Mr. Johnson, the school principal, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene before him. Mrs. Thompson, he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of authority. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Mrs. Thompson's demeanor shifted instantly, a forced smile replacing her scowl. Not at all, Mr. Johnson. We were just having a spirited discussion about The Catcher in the Rye. In fact, Alexander here was just about to explain why he thinks his interpretation is more valid than decades of literary criticism. Mr. Johnson's gaze flickered to Alex, who sat rigid in his seat, a mix of emotions playing across his face. For a moment, father and son locked eyes, an unspoken current of understanding passing between them. I see, Mr. Johnson said slowly. Well, don't let me interrupt. Please, continue your discussion. As Mr. Johnson took a seat at the back of the classroom, Alex felt a strange mix of dread and anticipation. The tension in the room was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Little did anyone know, this was the moment that would shatter the fragile balance of power in room 205 and set in motion a chain of events that would transform Maplewood Middle School forever. The atmosphere in room 205 crackled with tension as Mr. Johnson settled into a chair at the back of the classroom. Mrs. Thompson's forced smile wavered slightly as she turned back to face her students, her eyes darting nervously to the principal before focusing on Alex once more. Well, Alexander, she said, her voice sickly sweet, since you seem to have such unique insights into The Catcher in the Rye, why don't you elaborate for us? And for Mr. Johnson's benefit, of course. Alex swallowed hard, acutely aware of his father's presence behind him. He could feel the eyes of his classmates, a mix of pity and curiosity in their gazes. Taking a deep breath, he straightened in his seat. I believe, Alex began, his voice trembling slightly before gaining strength, that Holden's actions come from a place of deep pain and confusion. He's lost his brother, he's struggling to connect with people, and he's terrified of growing up in a world that seems cruel and unfair. Mrs. Thompson's lips thinned, but before she could interject, Alex continued. It's not about excusing his behavior, but understanding it. Holden needs help and compassion, not just judgment. A heavy silence fell over the room. Alex could hear his heart pounding in his ears, waiting for Mrs. Thompson's biting response. To his surprise, it was his father who broke the silence. That's a very thoughtful analysis, Alex, Mr. Johnson said, his voice calm but carrying a note of pride. Mrs. Thompson, how do you usually approach differing interpretations in your class discussions? Mrs. Thompson's face flushed, her composure slipping for a moment before she regained control. Well, Mr. Johnson, I believe in guiding students towards the most academically accepted interpretations. We can't have them running wild with every flight of fancy, now can we? Mr. Johnson nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. I see. And how do you encourage critical thinking and personal engagement with the text? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mrs. Thompson opened her mouth to respond, but the shrill ring of the bell cut her off. Students began gathering their things, the tension in the room dissipating slightly with the promise of escape. "Class dismissed," Mrs. Thompson announced, her voice tight. "Alexander, please stay behind. Mr. Johnson, might I have a word with you in private?" As the other students filed out, throwing curious glances over their shoulders, Alex remained rooted to his seat. He watched as his father followed Mrs. Thompson into the hallway, the door closing behind them with a soft click. In the sudden quiet of the empty classroom, Alex let out a shaky breath. He couldn't hear what was being said outside, but he could imagine the conversation. Would his father finally see Mrs. Thompson for who she really was? Or would she manage to charm her way out of the situation, leaving Alex to face even harsher treatment in the days to come? The minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. Alex's mind raced with possibilities, hope and dread warring in his chest. Whatever was happening out there in the hallway, he knew that things in room 205 would never be quite the same again. Finally, the door opened. Mr. Johnson stepped back into the room, his face serious but with a glimmer of something, determination, resolve, in his eyes. Behind him, Mrs. Thompson looked pale, her usual authoritarian demeanor notably absent. "Alex," Mr. Johnson said gently, "why don't you head to your next class? Mrs. Thompson and I need to continue our discussion." As Alex gathered his things and walked towards the door, he caught his father's reassuring nod. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. Whatever storm was brewing, he wouldn't have to weather it alone. The corridor outside room 205 was deserted, the distant echoes of students in other classrooms the only sound breaking the tense silence. Mr. Johnson stood with his back straight, his normally friendly face set in stern lines as he regarded Mrs. Thompson. "Margaret," he began, his voice low but firm, "I think it's time we had a frank discussion about your teaching methods." Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened, a flicker of defiance crossing her face before being replaced by a mask of professional concern. "Of course, Mr. Johnson. I'm always open to feedback. Is there something specific you'd like to address?" Mr. Johnson's gaze never wavered. "I've been hearing concerns about the atmosphere in your classroom, particularly regarding your treatment of certain students." Mrs. Thompson's laugh was brittle. "Surely you're not basing your judgment on playground gossip. I maintain high standards, that's all. Some students simply struggle to meet them." "Some students," Mr. Johnson repeated, his tone measured. "Like Alex Johnson, perhaps." The color drained from Mrs. Thompson's face as realization dawned. "Alex, he's your son?" Mr. Johnson nodded slowly. "He is. And while I've always made it a policy not to interfere in my children's school lives, I can no longer ignore what's been happening in this classroom." Mrs. Thompson's composure crumbled. "Mr. Johnson, I assure you, I had no idea. If I'd known Alex was your son, I would have—" "You would have what?" Mr. Johnson interrupted, his voice sharp. "Treated him with the respect and understanding that every student deserves? Because that's not what I've been witnessing, Margaret." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. Finally, Mr. Johnson sighed, his expression softening slightly. "Margaret, I know you're a dedicated educator. Your students consistently perform well on standardized tests. But education is about more than just test scores. It's about nurturing minds, encouraging critical thinking, and fostering a love of learning." Mrs. Thompson's shoulders sagged, the fight seeming to leave her. I only wanted to prepare them for the real world. It's not always kind out there." "No, it's not," Mr. Johnson agreed. "But that doesn't mean our classrooms should mirror that unkindness. We should be a sanctuary, a place where students feel safe to explore ideas and make mistakes." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "There's something else you should know about Alex. He has a mild form of autism. It's not severe, and it doesn't impact his intelligence or ability to learn, but it does affect how he interacts with the world, how he processes information and emotions." Mrs. Thompson's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and dawning horror. "Oh God, I had no idea. All this time I thought he was being difficult or disrespectful." Mr. Johnson's voice was gentle but firm. "Alex is an extraordinary boy. Thoughtful, intelligent, and incredibly resilient. But your treatment of him, it's been damaging, Margaret. Not just to Alex, but to every student who's witnessed it and learned that this kind of behavior is acceptable from an authority figure." Tears welled in Mrs. Thompson's eyes. years of rigid control crumbling in the face of this revelation. What? What happens now? Now, Mr. Johnson said, we make changes. Significant ones. I'll be implementing new training programs on inclusive education and positive discipline strategies. And you, Margaret, will be taking a leave of absence to undergo sensitivity training and counseling. Mrs. Thompson nodded mutely, the full weight of her actions finally sinking in. Remember, Mr. Johnson concluded, it's never too late to learn and grow. That's a lesson we should all take to heart, teachers and students alike. As they re-entered the classroom, both knew that this was more than just a conversation. It was the beginning of a transformation, not just for Mrs. Thompson or Alex, but for the entire Maplewood Middle School community. The next morning, a palpable change hung in the air as students filed into room 205. Whispers and curious glances darted around the classroom, growing more intense when Mr. Johnson entered instead of Mrs. Thompson. "Good morning, class," Mr. Johnson began, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of authority. "I'm sure you've all noticed that Mrs. Thompson isn't here today. She'll be taking a leave of absence, and I'll be overseeing this class in the meantime." A collective murmur rippled through the room. Alex, seated near the back, felt a mix of relief and apprehension wash over him. Mr. Johnson held up a hand, quieting the class. "Before we begin today's lesson, I want to have an important discussion with all of you about respect, diversity, and the true purpose of education." He moved to the front of the room, perching on the edge of Mrs. Thompson's desk in a gesture that immediately set a more relaxed tone. "In recent weeks, it's come to my attention that the atmosphere in this classroom hasn't been conducive to learning and growth for all students. I want you to know that this is being addressed, but more importantly, I want to talk about how we move forward from here." The students listened intently, many sitting up straighter in their seats. "Education isn't just about memorizing facts or scoring well on tests," Mr. Johnson continued. "It's about learning to think critically, to question, to engage with ideas different from your own. It's about growing not just as students, but as human beings." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Part of that growth involves understanding and respecting the diversity among us. Every person in this room has a unique perspective, shaped by their experiences, their challenges, and their strengths. And every single one of those perspectives has value." Alex felt a lump form in his throat as his father's eyes briefly met his. "Some of you may face challenges that aren't immediately visible to others," Mr. Johnson went on. "Learning differences, mental health struggles, family issues. These are all part of the human experience. They don't make anyone less worthy of respect or understanding. If anything, they add depth and richness to our community." A few students nodded, while others looked thoughtful. "Moving forward, I want this classroom, this school, to be a place where everyone feels safe to express themselves, to make mistakes, and to learn from those mistakes. Where kindness and empathy are valued as highly as academic achievement." Mr. Johnson stood, moving to write on the whiteboard. "Today, we're going to start by discussing what respect means to each of you. How can we create an environment where everyone feels valued and heard?" As the discussion began, tentatively at first, but soon growing more animated, Alex felt a weight he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying start to lift. For the first time in weeks, he raised his hand to contribute, and when he spoke, his classmates listened, not with fear or pity, but with genuine interest. By the end of the class, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Students were talking animatedly, sharing ideas about how to make their school more inclusive. Even those who had previously been silent were finding their voices. As the bell rang, Mr. Johnson called out, "Remember, this is just the beginning. Change doesn't happen overnight, but with commitment and compassion, we can create something truly special here." As the students filed out, many paused to thank Mr. Johnson or share additional thoughts. Alex hung back, waiting until the room had cleared before approaching his father. "Dad," he said softly, "thank you." Mr. Johnson pulled his son into a tight hug. "No, Alex. Thank you for being brave enough to stand up for what's right, even when it was hard. You've taught me an important lesson too." As they left the classroom together, both father and son knew that while challenges lay ahead, they had taken the first crucial steps towards positive change. The journey of transformation for Maplewood Middle School had truly begun, The following weeks at Maplewood Middle School unfolded like the pages of a new book, filled with promise and possibility. Room 205, once a fortress of fear, had transformed into a sanctuary of learning and growth. At the helm stood Ms. Hanson, a substitute teacher carefully selected by Mr. Johnson for her progressive teaching methods and empathetic approach. On a crisp Monday morning, Alex entered the classroom, his steps lighter than they had been in months. The desks, once arranged in rigid rows, now formed a welcoming circle. Colorful posters adorned the walls, bearing quotes about inclusivity and the power of diverse perspectives. "Good morning, everyone," Ms. Hanson greeted the class, her warm smile reaching her eyes. "Today, we're going to try something a little different. We'll be exploring To Kill a Mockingbird through a series of role-playing exercises." A mix of excitement and nervousness rippled through the room. Alex felt his heart quicken, but not with the familiar dread of being singled out. Instead, he felt a spark of curiosity. "The goal," Ms. Hanson continued, "is to step into the characters' shoes, to really feel and understand their experiences. Remember, there are no wrong answers here, only opportunities to learn and grow together." As the class divided into small groups, Alex found himself partnered with Emily, a quiet girl he'd barely spoken to before, and Jason, a boisterous boy who had often laughed at Mrs. Thompson's harsh comments. "So," Jason began, a hint of his old bravado in his voice, "who wants to be Atticus?" Alex hesitated, then raised his hand. I'd like to try if that's okay." To his surprise, Jason nodded encouragingly. "Go for it, man. You always had good ideas about the book." As they delved into the exercise, Alex felt a newfound confidence blooming within him. He articulated Atticus's moral dilemmas with a depth that surprised even himself, drawing from his own recent experiences of standing up for what was right. Emily, playing scout, offered insightful observations about innocence and prejudice. Even Jason, taking on the role of Bob Ewell, showed unexpected nuance in portraying the complexities of ignorance and fear. Ms. Hanson moved from group to group, offering gentle guidance and thought-provoking questions. When she reached Alex's group, she paused to listen, a smile of approval on her face. "Excellent work," she commended them. "You're really capturing the essence of these characters. Alex, your interpretation of Atticus is particularly nuanced. Would you be willing to share some of your thoughts with the class?" In the past, such a request would have filled Alex with dread. But now, bolstered by the supportive atmosphere and his growing self-confidence, he nodded. As Alex stood to address his classmates, he caught sight of his father observing quietly from the doorway. Mr. Johnson gave him a subtle thumbs up, his eyes shining with pride. "Atticus Finch," Alex began, his voice steady, "teaches us that true courage isn't about physical strength or winning every battle. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, even when you're afraid." As he continued, drawing parallels between the book and their own experiences, Alex noticed his classmates listening intently, nodding in agreement. For the first time, he felt truly heard and valued in this classroom. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, there was a collective groan of disappointment. Students lingered, eagerly discussing the exercise and making plans to continue their conversations at lunch. As Alex packed up his things, Emily approached him shyly. "That was really cool, what you said about Atticus," she said. "I never thought about the book that way before." Jason chimed in, "Yeah, man, you've got some serious analysis skills. We should study together sometime." Alex felt a warm glow of acceptance wash over him. As he left the classroom, exchanging a proud smile with his father, he realized that this wasn't just a new beginning for the class. It was a new beginning for him, too. As autumn gave way to winter, the changes at Maplewood Middle School continued to unfold like a tapestry of transformation. Room 205, once a battleground, had become a haven of intellectual curiosity and mutual respect. Alex, who had once shrunk from attention, now found himself at the center of a supportive network of friends and engaged classmates. One frosty morning, Mr. Johnson stood before the school assembly, his breath visible in the chilly air of the gymnasium. "Today," he announced, "we're launching a new initiative called Voices of Maplewood. This program will provide a platform for students and teachers alike to share their experiences, challenges, and triumphs." A murmur of interest rippled through the crowd. Alex, seated between Emily and Jason, felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Our first speaker, Mr. Johnson continued, is someone who has shown remarkable courage and resilience. Please welcome Alex Johnson. A hush fell over the gymnasium as Alex made his way to the podium. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edges, but when he looked out at the sea of faces, he saw encouragement rather than judgment. A few months ago, Alex began, his voice gaining strength with each word. I dreaded coming to school. I felt isolated, misunderstood, and afraid to be myself. He paused, taking a deep breath. But I've learned that every one of us has the power to create change. By speaking up, by showing compassion, by being willing to listen and learn from each other, we can transform our school and our lives. As Alex shared his journey, the struggles with Mrs. Thompson, his diagnosis of mild autism, and the support he'd found in his newfound friends, he saw heads nodding in recognition. Some students wiped away tears, while others wore expressions of dawning understanding. My experience isn't unique, Alex concluded. Each of us faces challenges, visible or invisible, but together, we can create a community where everyone feels valued and empowered to reach their full potential. The applause that erupted as Alex finished was thunderous. As he made his way back to his seat, students reached out to pat him on the back or offer words of support. In the days that followed, the impact of Alex's speech rippled through the school. Students who had previously kept to themselves began to open up, sharing their own stories. The Voices of Maplewood program flourished, featuring speakers on topics ranging from learning disabilities to cultural differences. Even the teachers were affected. During a staff meeting, Ms. Hansen shared how Alex's resilience had inspired her to reevaluate her own teaching methods. It's a reminder, she said, that our students have so much to teach us, if we're willing to listen. As winter deepened, Mr. Johnson introduced another initiative, group sessions led by the school psychologist Dr. Martinez. These workshops focused on fostering empathy, understanding differences, and building a united school community. During one such session, as students and teachers alike engaged in trust-building exercises, a surprising revelation came to light. Mrs. Parker, the school librarian, shared that she had known Mrs. Thompson for years. Margaret wasn't always like this, Mrs. Parker explained, her voice soft with compassion. A few years ago, her husband left her, taking their children with him. She became bitter, lonely. I think she felt powerless in her personal life and overcompensated in the classroom. This insight sparked a discussion about the complexities of human behavior and the importance of compassion, even for those who have hurt us. It was a powerful lesson in empathy that resonated deeply with everyone present. As the session ended, Alex found himself reflecting on his own journey. He had faced adversity and emerged stronger, not just for himself, but as a catalyst for positive change in his school community. The power of resilience, he realized, lay not just in enduring hardship, but in using those experiences to create a better world for everyone. As winter thawed into spring, Maplewood Middle School blossomed with more than just the flowers in its courtyard. The seeds of change planted months ago had taken root, transforming the school's culture in ways both subtle and profound. One sunny afternoon, Mr. Johnson called Alex into his office. The principal's desk, usually neatly ordered, was covered with colorful cards and letters. These, Mr. Johnson explained, gesturing to the pile, are messages of support and gratitude from students, parents, and even other schools who've heard about our Voices of Maplewood program. Your courage, Alex, has sparked a movement that's reaching beyond our walls. Alex felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a mixture of pride and humility. I couldn't have done it without everyone's support, he said softly. Mr. Johnson nodded, then hesitated, his expression growing serious. There's something else I wanted to discuss with you. It's about Mrs. Thompson. Alex tensed involuntarily, but his father's gentle tone helped him relax. She's been undergoing intensive therapy and training, Mr. Johnson continued, and she's expressed a desire to make amends. She's asked if she could meet with you, to apologize in person, but only if you're comfortable with it. Alex fell silent, a whirlwind of emotions coursing through him. Part of him wanted to refuse, to keep the wounds of the past firmly sealed. But another part, the part that had grown stronger through his experiences, was curious. I think I'd like to hear what she has to say, Alex finally replied. The meeting was arranged for the following week in Mr. Johnson's office, with Dr. Martinez present for support. When Mrs. Thompson entered, Alex was struck by how different she looked. Gone was the rigid posture and severe expression. Instead, she appeared softer, more human. "Alex," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "I want to apologize for my behavior. I was wrong, so terribly wrong in how I treated you and your classmates." As Mrs. Thompson spoke, explaining how her personal pain had twisted into professional cruelty, Alex felt his anger and fear slowly melting away. In their place grew something unexpected: compassion. "I understand now," Mrs. Thompson continued, "that my job as an educator isn't just to teach subjects, but to nurture and support my students. I failed in that duty, and I'm deeply sorry." Alex took a deep breath. "Thank you for apologizing, Mrs. Thompson. I won't say it was easy, but I forgive you, and I hope you can forgive yourself too." The tension in the room dissipated, replaced by a sense of healing and new beginnings. In the weeks that followed, Mrs. Thompson's return to Maplewood was a gradual process. She started by observing classes, learning from teachers like Ms. Hanson, who embodied the school's new ethos of empathy and inclusivity. Her first day back in the classroom was met with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity from the students. But as she led them through a thoughtful discussion on To Kill a Mockingbird, focusing on themes of prejudice and redemption, it became clear that her transformation was genuine. During one particularly poignant moment, Mrs. Thompson paused in her lesson. "You know," she said, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room, "Atticus Finch once said, 'You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb inside of his skin and walk around in it.' I'm only now beginning to truly understand the wisdom of those words." As the school year drew to a close, Maplewood Middle School had become a model of positive change. Visitors from other districts came to observe and learn from their programs. The Voices of Maplewood initiative had expanded, with students and teachers regularly sharing their stories and insights. For Alex, watching his small act of courage blossom into such far-reaching change was both humbling and inspiring. As he looked forward to the next chapter of his academic journey, he knew that the lessons learned in resilience, empathy, and the power of speaking up would stay with him forever. 2 years had passed since the transformative events at Maplewood Middle School. The once dreaded Room 205 had become a beacon of progressive education, its walls adorned with student artwork and inspirational quotes celebrating diversity and inclusion. On a warm June afternoon, as the school year drew to a close, Mr. Johnson stood before a gathered crowd of students, teachers, and parents in the auditorium. His face beamed with pride as he addressed the assembly. "When we began this journey," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed room, "we couldn't have imagined the profound impact it would have, not just on our school, but on our entire community." In the front row, Alex sat tall, a far cry from the timid boy he had once been. Beside him was Mrs. Thompson, her face serene, having found her calling as an advocate for inclusive education. Mr. Johnson continued, "Today, Maplewood stands as a model for schools across the country. Our Voices of Maplewood program has been adopted by districts nationwide, fostering empathy and understanding in countless classrooms." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "But more importantly, we've seen the change in each of you. The compassion, the courage to speak up, the willingness to listen and learn from one another. These are the true measures of our success." As the assembly concluded, Alex found himself surrounded by friends and classmates, all excitedly discussing their plans for high school and beyond. The air was filled with a sense of possibility and hope. Later, as Alex walked home with his father, Mr. Johnson placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You know, Alex," he said softly, "what started with your bravery has touched so many lives. You should be proud." Alex smiled, feeling the weight of the future bright before him. "I am," he replied, "but I'm more excited about what we'll do next. There's still so much good we can do in the world." As they walked into the setting sun, both father and son knew that this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. The ripples of change they had set in motion would continue to spread, touching lives far beyond the walls of Maplewood Middle School, a testament to the enduring power of courage, compassion, and the indomitable human spirit. What did you think of the school principal's attitude? Would you do the same? In the end, Respect is always the best way forward, right? Leave a comment with your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I'm sure there will be new videos to surprise you. Like and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos. See you soon.